We shall study the principle of res judicata in 4 parts. Part 1, Section 11 of the Civil Procedure Code. Part 2, explanations to Section 11. There are 8 explanations in all. Part 3, the general principle of res judicata. And Part 4, judicial extension of the scope of Section 11. We begin with the statutory provision as contained in Section 11 of the Civil Procedure Code. This section says that no court shall try any suit in which the matter directly and substantially in issue has been directly and substantially in issue in a former suit between the same parties in a court competent to try such subsequent suit and has been heard and finally decided by such court. The first thing to be noted from this section is that this is a direction to a court. The court has been mandated not to try a suit of a specific kind, and what type of suit is not to be tried by a court we shall see in the next slide. Here we will see the ingredients of Section 11. There was a former suit and there is a subsequent suit. So we are talking of two suits, a former suit and a subsequent suit. The matter in issue in the subsequent suit is the same as in the former suit. Parties in the subsequent suit are either the same as in the former suit or they claim from them. The fourth ingredient is that the former suit was heard and finally decided by the former court. And lastly, the former court should be competent to try the subsequent suit. These are the 5 ingredients for applicability of Section 11. If these 5 ingredients are satisfied, then the court shall not try the subsequent suit. Let us try to understand the 5th ingredient more closely. What is meant by the former court not being competent to try the subsequent suit? Let us take an illustration. In a suit for partition, the value of the subject matter of the former suit was rupees 50 lakhs, and this suit was filed in the district court and decided by the district court. So the former court in this case happens to be the district court. A subsequent suit is filed in the High Court where the value of the subject matter is rupees 5 crore, and since the pecuniary limit of the district court is limited to rupees 1 crore, this suit having a value of rupees 5 crore has to be filed in the next higher court, that is the High Court. So in this case, the former court is the district court, the subsequent suit is filed in the High Court, and the former court, that is the district court, is not competent to try the subsequent suit. Why? Because the value of the subject matter of the subsequent suit is beyond the pecuniary limit of the district court. Therefore, the district court cannot try such a suit. Since the former court is not competent to try the subsequent suit, in such a situation, Section 11 will not be applicable. Let us come to the second part of our discussion, that is the 8 explanations annexed to Section 11. The first explanation tells us what is meant by a former suit. It says, a former suit shall denote a suit which has been decided prior to the suit in question, whether or not it was instituted prior thereto. What matters is the date on which the former suit is decided, the date of institution of the suit is not relevant. If a suit is decided first prior in time, then it is a former suit, and that suit which is decided subsequently, that is known as the subsequent suit. Explanation 3 says, in the former suit, the matter must have been alleged by one party and either denied or admitted expressly or impliedly by the other. In section 11, we are concerned with the matter directly and substantially in issue in the former suit and also in the subsequent suit. What is meant by the matter directly and substantially in issue in the former suit? That matter should have been alleged by one party and should have either been denied or been admitted by the other party. Explanation 4 says, any matter which might and ought to have been made ground of defense or attack in such former suit shall be deemed to have been a matter directly and substantially in issue in such suit. Now this explanation is expanding the scope of section 11. Section 11 as it stands limits itself to those matters which were directly and substantially in issue in the former suit. Explanation 4 extends and expands the scope of the section by including in this definition of matter also those matters which, though actually were not directly and substantially in issue in the former suit, but shall be deemed to have been so involved in that suit. And which are these matters? Explanation 4 includes in the definition that matter which, though was actually not in issue in the former suit, but that matter which might have been made a ground of defense or attack and which ought to have been made a ground of defense or attack. Such matter which was actually not in issue but which could have been brought either as a ground of defense or as a ground of attack in the former suit. That matter will also be included when we are discussing the scope of section 11. Explanation 5 says, any relief claimed in the plaint which is not expressly granted by the decree shall be deemed to have been refused. A plaintiff may make many claims in the plaint. Those reliefs which have been either expressly granted or expressly refused will be treated accordingly, but that relief about which the decree is silent, that relief which is claimed in the plaint but about which the decree is silent shall be deemed to have been refused by the court. Once again, it is a deeming provision. And then explanation 6, which says, where persons litigate bona fide in respect of a public right or in respect of a private right claimed in common for themselves and others, then all persons interested in such right shall be deemed to claim under the persons so litigating. This explanation also expands the scope of section 11. Let us see how it does so. We will see a statement of law made by the Supreme Court in Narayan Prabhu Venkateswara Prabhu versus Narayan Prabhu Krishna Prabhu. The court in this case said and discussed these issues. In a partition suit, each party claiming that the property is joint asserts a right and litigates under a title which is common to others who make identical claims. So all those parties which are claiming that the property is joint they are asserting a right which is common to all of them. If that issue is litigated in a suit, what issue? The issue whether the property is joint or not. If that issue is litigated in a suit and decided, the others making the same claim who are not actually party to that partition suit shall be held to be claiming a right in common for themselves and others. Each of them can be deemed, by reason of explanation 6, to represent all those the nature of whose claims and interests are common or identical. Because of the force of explanation 6, those parties which have a common right but which were not actually a party to the suit which has been decided will be deemed to have been a party to that suit. Let us take an illustration. There are three persons who claim that a property is joint, whereas the fourth person claims it to be his separate property. And there is a partition suit in which there is a claim that a given property is joint, and this claim is denied by the other party which says that it is a separate property. Now, a suit by any one of these three parties against the fourth one is decided by a competent court. Let's take the case where a suit is filed by one of these three parties which are claiming the property to be joint. This suit is filed by one of these three parties, and the defendant is the fourth party which claims that the property is actually his separate property. This suit is filed and this suit is decided by a competent court. The second person and the third person were actually not a party to this suit. The second and third person, though actually not a party to the suit, will be deemed to have litigated under the first person, and this deeming provision is coming from explanation 6. So the second and third party will be deemed to have litigated under the first person, and a subsequent suit filed by any one of them, that is either by the second party or the third party, shall not be tried by a court because of the bar imposed by section 11. The earlier decision shall operate as res judicata. So this is the import of explanation 6. Explanation 7 simply extends these provisions to a proceeding for execution of a decree, which means that the principle of res judicata is applicable not only to the decisions made in a suit but also to proceedings for executions of decrees. When we apply these provisions to the execution proceedings, suit shall refer to a proceeding for execution, issue shall refer to a question arising in such proceeding, and former suit shall refer to a former proceeding for execution of that decree. Lastly, we come to explanation 8. An issue heard and finally decided by a court of limited jurisdiction, competent to decide such issue, shall operate as res judicata in a subsequent suit, notwithstanding that such court of limited jurisdiction was not competent to try the suit in which such issue has been subsequently raised. This explanation also expands the scope of section 11. We saw earlier that the last ingredient of section 11 limits the application of section 11 to those cases where the former court is competent to try the subsequent suit. And in all those cases where the former court is not competent to try the subsequent suit, section 11 shall not be applicable. And we had seen an illustration also to that effect. That restriction is now being lifted by explanation 8. and it says that the principle of res judicata as enshrined in section 11 will be applicable even in a case where the former court which decided the issue is of limited jurisdiction and that court is not competent to try the suit in which such issue has been subsequently raised. We'll take the same illustration once again and see the effect of explanation 8. This is the illustration we had considered earlier. There was a suit for partition, and in this suit the value of the subject matter was rupees 50 lakhs, and this suit was decided by the district court. So the district court becomes the former court and this suit will be known as the former suit. Then a subsequent suit is filed in the High Court, and the suit is filed in the High Court because the value of the subject matter of this subsequent suit is 5 crore, which exceeds the pecuniary limit of the district court pegged at rupees 1 crore. An issue decided by the district court in the former suit, shall operate as res judicata in the subsequent suit. This happens because of explanation 8. We had seen earlier that the statutory provision as contained in section 11 will not be applicable to such an illustration, to such a case, because the former court is not competent to try the subsequent suit, but section explanation 8 lifts that restriction and makes it applicable even in such a case. Section 11 is now applicable to a case where the former court is not competent to try the subsequent suit also. So these are the 8 explanations, and they expand the scope of section 11 as enacted statutorily. Now we come to the third part and we will see what is the general principle of res judicata. Res judicata is a Latin phrase which means a thing judicially determined or a thing judicially decided. This principle of res judicata is a rule of evidence which prohibits the reassertion of a cause of action. What is the basis of this principle? The basis of the principle of res judicata, the doctrine is based on 2 theories. Firstly, finality and conclusiveness of judicial decisions for the final termination of disputes in the general interest of the community as a matter of public policy. And secondly, interest of the individual that he should be protected from multiplication of litigation. So the principle of res judicata is based on 2 considerations. The first consideration is the general interest of the community, and it's a matter of public policy that judicial decisions should attain finality and conclusiveness. And the second consideration is the interest of the individual. The individual should be protected from multiplication of litigation. These are the 2 considerations on the basis of which this principle has been applied. Let's see what the general principle is. It is the cause of action which gives rise to an action. There is first a cause of action, and since there is a cause of action, there becomes available an action. A cause of action which results in a judgment must lose its identity and vitality and merge in the judgment when pronounced. The cause of action merges in the judgment. Since the cause of action does not survive the judgment, it cannot give rise to another action. And this is what is known as the general principle of res judicata. A cause of action which has merged into a judgment cannot give rise to another action. Therefore, once a matter has been decided by a competent court in an action, then it cannot be re-agitated. Res judicata is not confined to the issues which the court is actually asked to decide, but it also covers those issues or facts which are so clearly part of the subject matter of the litigation and so clearly could have been raised that it would be an abuse of the process of the court to allow a new proceeding to be started in respect of them. So, not only those matters which were actually decided by the court, but even those matters which could have been raised during the proceedings of the former suit but which were not actually raised, those matters will also be treated to have been decided and there can be no re-agitation on those matters. This rule is referred as constructive res judicata, which in reality is only an aspect or amplification of the general principle. And as we saw earlier, this rule of constructive res judicata has been statutorily recognized in the Civil Procedure Code in the form of explanation 4 to section 11. These simple but efficacious rules of evidence, which are the two rules of evidence, the general principle and the constructive res judicata. These two rules of evidence have culminated in the present section 11 of the Code of Civil Procedure. However, there is a limitation to section 11 and the limitation is that section 11 relates only to suits and former suits and therefore in terms it has no direct application to a petition for the issue of a high prerogative writ. It has no direct application to writ proceedings because the section itself talks only of former suits and subsequent suits. So, these questions arise and we need to answer these questions. First question, can a decision given in a writ proceeding operate as res judicata in a subsequent regular suit? Here we are talking, the first proceeding is in the form of a writ proceeding. It's not a former suit. However, the second proceeding is in the form of the suit, so we can call it as subsequent suit. Second question, can a decision given in a regular suit operate as res judicata in a subsequent writ proceeding? Now we have reversed the situation and the first proceeding was in the form of a regular suit, so it can be called as former suit, but the second proceeding is not a subsequent suit, rather it is a subsequent writ proceeding. And we can have a third situation also where the first proceeding was a writ proceeding and the subsequent proceeding is also a writ proceeding. So the common question is, can a decision given in such proceedings or regular suits operate as res judicata in subsequent proceedings or suits? If the former is also a suit and the subsequent is also a suit, definitely section 11 is applicable. But if in one of the points of time it is a writ proceeding, will section 11 be still applicable? To find answers to these questions, we will discuss a very important case decided by the Supreme Court in 1964, and the case is Gulab Chand Chotalal Parikh versus State of Bombay. A very important proposition of law was declared by the Supreme Court in this case, which has a wide implication and it drastically extends the scope of section 11. In this case, the Supreme Court said that the provisions of section 11 CPC are not exhaustive. This is a declaration of law made by the Supreme Court in this case. The provisions of section 11 CPC are not exhaustive with respect to an earlier decision operating as res judicata between the same parties on the same matter in controversy in a subsequent regular suit. The court said that on the general principle of res judicata, any previous decision on a matter in controversy decided after full contest or after affording fair opportunities to the parties to prove their case by a court competent to decide it will operate as res judicata in a subsequent regular suit. And the important phrase is any previous decision, whether that previous decision was as a result of institution of a suit or that previous decision might be as a result of filing of a writ petition. It doesn't matter. Any previous decision on a matter in controversy will operate as res judicata in a subsequent proceeding. And the court has made it very clear in the next observation, saying that it is not necessary that the court deciding the matter formerly be competent to decide the subsequent suit, or that the former proceeding and the subsequent suit have the same subject matter. And finally, the court declares that the nature of the former proceeding is immaterial. It does not matter what is the nature of the former proceeding. It may be a suit, it may be a writ proceeding, whatever, the result is the same, which means the principle of res judicata shall be applicable whether the former proceeding is arising out of a suit or the former proceeding arose out of a writ petition. This drastically expands the scope of section 11. Armed with this statement of law from the Supreme Court that the nature of the former proceeding is immaterial, let us now set out to answer the three questions which we had set out for ourselves earlier. These were the questions: can a decision given in a writ proceeding operate as res judicata in a subsequent regular suit? The answer is yes, because the nature of the former proceeding is immaterial. Similarly, answer to the second question will also be yes, and answer to the third question will also be yes. Regardless of the nature of the former proceeding, the rule of res judicata will become applicable in a subsequent proceeding.